Chapter 9. The Theistic Argument from Ontogeny and Phylogeny. We have now before us all the salient facts and phenomena of organic evolution that are necessary to enable us to reach a definite conclusion in regard to the question of the origin of life on this planet. The fundamental law of organic evolution has been stated in the language of its ablest exponent and accepted as correct in every sense of the word. There is, therefore, no disagreement either as to the facts from which the law has been induced, or as to the correctness of the induction. It must be remembered, however, that the facts and the law, as thus agreed upon by and between the contending parties, all pertain to the subject of organic evolution as they are manifested in phenomena in the visible organic world, beginning with the monera and culminating in man. The matter in dispute lies outside the realm of what is cognizable by the senses, but it is not outside the dominion of law. It is not outside the domain of the law which has been found to exist, and which has been formulated in the preceding pages of this book. It is purely a matter of deduction from that known fundamental law of organic evolution, that first principle of biogeny, to which all questions pertaining to the subject matter must be referred. The fact that a force is invisible does not remove it from the domain of law. All the forces of nature are invisible, and yet we harness them to our uses and formulate their laws. The mind energy that animates the monera is invisible, but it is the creature of law. And so is the source from which the moneron derived its life and mind, whether it resided in the rocks and mud of the inorganic earth or emanated from an infinite antecedent mind. The fact that a causal relation existed between the two brings them under the law of commensuration, and hence under the fundamental law of organic evolution. That is to say, since the causal forces of nature are always necessarily commensurable with their terrestrial modes or forms of manifestation, it follows that they are governed by the same laws. We may, therefore, deduce from the known law all legitimate conclusions relating to antecedent causes or consequent effects, with the same confidence that we should feel if all the forces of nature were visible. Before proceeding to draw our conclusions, it will be in order to enumerate the points of agreement between atheistic and theistic evolutionists. In that way, the issue between them will be developed and clearly defined, and no time will be wasted in the discussion of irrelevant questions. The essential points are the following inductions. 1. That the history of the development of the human germinal cell, from the moneron to the fully developed human entity, is a recapitulation of the history of the development of the primordial germ, from the moneron to man, or, in other words, that ontogeny is a repetition of phylogeny. 2. That phylogeny is the cause of ontogeny. 3. That the law of heredity is the agency through which phylogeny controls ontogeny. 4. That the law of heredity is universal in its application to the subject matter, beginning with the moneron and culminating in man, on the one hand, and, on the other, beginning with the germinal cell and culminating in a fully developed human entity. Deductions. 1. That the potentialities of manhood reside in the germinal cell of man. 2. That the potentialities of manhood reside in the primordial germ. This, perhaps, is as far as it is prudent to go in assuming the points of agreement between atheism and theism. I have ventured thus far only because the foregoing propositions are all essential to the doctrine of organic evolution, and they have all been insisted upon as fundamental by the atheistic evolutionists. The next step would be some such proposition as that what is true of ontogeny is also true of phylogeny, or that nature is constant, or that nature's laws admit of no exceptions. Each of which propositions atheism tacitly denies when it seeks to account for the origin of life on the theory of spontaneous generation. We must, therefore, now proceed independently to draw conclusions from the premises that have been agreed upon. The first proposition is that, if it is true that ontogeny, by virtue of the law of heredity, is a repetition of phylogeny, it follows that the laws of the two are identical. No one can deny this proposition without impeaching the law of heredity itself, for it is but a restatement of the very essence of that law. Its truth is, in fact, self-evident. Secondly, since the law of ontogeny is identical with the law of phylogeny, and since identical results have ensued, it follows that the pre-existing conditions were identical. The truth of this proposition also is self-evident. Thirdly, since the law, the results, and the conditions were each identical, it follows that the causes of those conditions were also identical in character and kind. No person can deny this proposition without impeaching the constancy of nature. The universal experience of mankind may be invoked to verify it. Like causes produce like effects. Identical conditions are brought about by causes identical in kind. These are axioms, and they apply with unvarying exactitude in all the broad realm of natural causes and effects. They are, in fact, but varying forms of expressing that universal postulate, the constancy of nature. Now, let us see how these propositions apply to the subject matter under consideration. In making this examination, we will again return to the beginning of organic life, for the reason that, as has often been repeated, the nearer we approach to its source, the more clearly will the observable facts and phenomena reveal the essential character of that source. If facts are to be found in the phylogenetic series that point to spontaneous generation as the source and origin of mind and life, we must expect to find them there. For, in the language of Haeckel, the monera actually stand on the very boundary between organic and inorganic natural bodies. On the other hand, if facts are to be found in either ontogeny or phylogeny that point to a divine origin of mind and life, we must still expect to find it at the beginning of organic life. For the monera also stand on the very boundary between the realms of mind and matter. Literally, the monera stand nearer to God than any other sentient creatures. Now, we have already learned from Professor Haeckel that the beginning of organic life in the phylogenetic series, is exactly repeated in the beginning of human ontogeny. We have also learned that the salient features of phylogeny are repeated in orderly sequence in ontogeny. And finally, that the culmination in each of the two series is identical with that in the other. In short, they both begin with the moneron and culminate in a human being. We also learn, from the same high authority, that the law of heredity constitutes the connecting link between the two series, and hence phylogeny is the cause of ontogeny. Being thus inseparably interrelated by causal connections, it follows that both series are controlled by the same law. This, then, disposes of my first proposition. The second proposition is that since the law and the results are the same, it follows that the pre-existing conditions were identical. The conditions referred to are those existing at the beginning alike of phylogeny and ontogeny. Those essential to the present inquiry are the following. 1. An unorganized, undifferentiated, homogeneous mass of protoplasm. 2. An unorganized, undifferentiated, homogeneous mass of protoplasm endowed with a mind. 3. An unorganized, undifferentiated, homogeneous mass of protoplasm endowed with a mind in which inhere the potentialities of manhood. These are the conditions that are common to the beginnings of the two series of events. They are the basic conditions upon which depend all the other steps in the two series. The physical conditions are the same in both, and necessarily the mental conditions are identical, or the final results could not be the same. We know, therefore, that the conditions are the same, for we know that the final result, a human being, is identical. Thus far no scientific evolutionist, atheistic or theistic, will gainsay either my propositions or my conclusions, for they are all elementary deductions from the fundamental principle of organic evolution, as laid down by its ablest exponent. The third proposition is that, the conditions being the same, it follows that the causes of those conditions were identical in character and kind. This proposition, as before remarked, no person can deny without impeaching the constancy of nature. The conditions for which we are in search of a cause are stated above. The salient feature, which includes the others, is the fact that the mind with which the moneron and the moneron are each endowed contains the potentialities of manhood. The question is, what is the cause of this condition? Science tells us that it exists alike in both, and that it produces identical results in phylogeny and ontogeny, namely, manhood. How does it happen that these globules of protoplasm are thus endowed with such wonderful potentialities? Science tells us that they are exactly alike in every particular. The chemical constituents of their bodies are the same. They are equally deficient in structural organism. Their minds have the same powers, attributes, and potentialities. And the grand results of the exercise of those powers and the development of those potentialities are identical, for they culminate in the same human entity. It is, in fact, impossible to imagine conditions more nearly alike or more certainly the result of causes identical in character and kind. It follows that if we can ascertain the cause in one case, we shall know with equal certainty the exact nature of the cause in the other. There will be no guesswork about it, no soaring into the regions of speculative philosophy in search of some fanciful theory of causation without facts to sustain it. Fortunately, it so happens that we know why it is that the germinal cell of man, the monorin, the initial organism in human ontogeny, is endowed with the potentialities of manhood. We know that it is because the parent from which it emanated was endowed with the attributes and qualities of manhood. In other words, we know that it emanated from an antecedent mind which was endowed with the identical attributes and powers that were developed from the initial organism. In short, we know that its powers and potentialities were due to the law of heredity. Now, let us carry the analogy back to the initial mind organism in the phylogenetic series. I submit that there is but one legitimate, logical conclusion, and that is that the mind of the monorin derived its attributes, powers, and potentialities under the law of heredity from an antecedent mind which was endowed with the identical attributes and powers, differing only in degree, that were developed from the monorin. To put the crucial point of the argument in a nutshell, we may say, why is it that the potentialities of manhood inhere in the germinal cell of man? Simply because it inherited them from a mind endowed with the actual faculties of manhood, namely, the mind of the finite parent. Again, why is it that the potentialities of manhood inhere in the primordial germ? Simply because it inherited them from a mind possessing the actual faculties of manhood, namely, the mind of the infinite parent. I submit that, in the language of Haeckel, this is taking possession of the facts of ontogeny and explaining them phylogenetically according to that law. I submit, further, that there is no other logical, scientific, or reasonable phylogenetic interpretation of the facts of ontogeny. Any other possible interpretation of those facts involves the utter repudiation of the law of heredity at the very point where that law is most in evidence, namely, at the beginning of organic life on this planet. It is most in evidence at that point in organic history, for upon every germinal cell, at the beginning of its ontogenetic history, is stamped the indubitable evidence of its descent from the monorin. All through the eons of time that have elapsed since the beginning of phylogenetic history, the law of heredity has asserted its supremacy, its constancy, and its universality, and millions of facts occur every day, each one of which bears testimony to this universal truth. If nature, as science instructs us, is the great teacher of order and uniformity, if she exhibits no false proportions and sounds no discords, if she sets up no false signals to deceive the unwary, if cause and effect bear any relation to each other, if, in short, nature is constant, we must suppose that the law of heredity did not originate in the monorin. We must suppose that it, too, was a creature of that law, and that its wonderful faculties and divine potentialities were inherited from a divine mind. This, then, is the analogical argument from ontogeny to phylogeny carried to its legitimate conclusion. If the analogy is perfect from man back to the monorin, as atheists very properly insist, if the law governing the two series of events is identical, as atheistic science has very clearly demonstrated, I submit that the analogy is not complete, and is therefore invalid, until it is carried back to the origin and cause of the life and mind of the monorin as well as that of the monorin. As I stated in the beginning, the analogical argument in this case is legitimate, valid, and conclusive, because the phenomena are the same and the law is identical. I still adhere to that conclusion and insist upon it. But I also insist that its evidential value depends upon its completeness, and that it is clearly not complete until it is carried as far in phylogeny as it is in ontogeny. What, then, has atheism to offer in refutation of this induction? Nothing, absolutely nothing, but the theory of spontaneous generation. As I have repeatedly dwelt upon the entire absence of facts to sustain that theory, I will content myself with a general summary of the salient features of the atheistic attitude on this and the subsidiary question as to the origin of species. I have shown that Darwin's theory that natural selection originated species was merely an attempt, in behalf of atheism, to sustain the theory that physical organism antedated mind, and was, in fact, the cause of mind. I have also shown, by Haeckel's demonstrations and Huxley's logic, that exactly the opposite is true, that in all the broad realm of sentient life, mind not only antedates physical organism, but is the cause of all structural changes in organism. This, however, I have no intention to dwell upon here. I mention it merely for the purpose of inviting renewed attention to the fact that Huxley admits that Darwin did not present one fact to prove that natural selection ever originated a species. On the contrary, the vast array of facts which Mr. Darwin so ably marshaled to prove his general theory of evolution are all against the theory that natural selection originated species. It preserved species the fittest, but it did not originate them. Nevertheless, while his friend, Professor Huxley, felt compelled to tell the truth about his failure to substantiate his hypothesis, he, Huxley, was fain to express the hope that somebody, on some future ontogeny, phylogeny, and theism, 357 occasion, would show that a new species could be originated by artificial selection, and thus give his friend Darwin's theory one fact to rest upon. Point 1 again. Professor Haeckel's theory of spontaneous generation rests upon the same hopeful foundation. He admits that there are no facts to prove his theory, that all experimental facts are against it, and he is not quite sure that it can ever be experimentally proven, unless great difficulties are overcome. But he very ably overcomes the difficulty thus encountered by questioning the sanity of those who do not accept his theory. Point 2. It is presumable, however, that he entertains the hope that somebody, someday, may be able to wrest a sign of life from inorganic matter. But he does not venture to express that hope in words. Last, but by no means least, we have our own great American scientist, Professor Lester F. Ward, who is also filled with hope for the future of the science of mind. His hope is in chemistry, and he believes that somebody will someday be able to produce the phenomena of life and mind by the process of recompounding, or aggregation, of albuminous compounds. Point 3. To be sure, it has never yet been done. And there are, of course, no facts to show that it ever can be done, but hope springs eternal in the atheistic breast just the same. These are but specimens of the boasted, inductive methods of the leading atheistic scientists of England, America, and Germany, when dealing with the problems of the human mind and soul. More especially when the question of the origin of mind and life is involved in their researches. If science stands for anything, it stands for truth. If the names I have mentioned suggest anything to those who know of their work, it is science and the inductive methods of research. They have written their names upon the scroll of fame in imperishable characters, and it was because of their unswerving devotion to truth as it is found revealed in the facts of nature. They set out in search of the origin of life, and when they found man's earliest earthly ancestor, they imagined that they had reached the final goal of their ambition. But it was there that they forever abandoned those methods of inductive research that had carried them so successfully through the mazes of evolutionary history. Was it because there were no facts upon which to base an inductive hypothesis of the origin of that life and mind which they found so conspicuously in evidence in man's earliest earthly ancestor? Clearly not. And yet nothing in the history of scientific research is more clearly evident than that they utterly abandoned and repudiated the inductive method at that crucial point in the history of their search for the origin of life. And what did they substitute as a compensation to science for the repudiation of the only method of research by which man can be sure that he knows anything? They substituted a purely speculative hypothesis, the mere statement of which constitutes a reductio ad absurdum, a theory that suggests nothing but a recrudescence of fetishism divested of its redeeming features. Why it is that atheistic scientists have chosen to ignore all that vast array of facts that point so unerringly to a divine origin of life and mind, I leave others to judge. There are but two hypotheses to choose from. One is that it was because they had the logical capacity to see that the facts all conspired to prove the divine origin of mind, and the other is that they had not that capacity. However, the world owes them a debt of gratitude for demonstrating the evolutionary hypothesis by means of facts that also prove the divine origin of life and mind. If those facts establish the truth of the evolutionary hypothesis, they are equally demonstrative of the theistic hypothesis. And there is no possible way of evading or denying the latter, except by repudiating the law of heredity, the law of cause and effect, the validity of the inductive method of research, in short. There is no possible way of evading the theistic interpretation of those facts except by the repudiation of every rule or axiom of scientific, logical, or rational investigation by which the validity of conclusions can be established. I have now briefly outlined the salient facts of organic evolution which bear upon the question of the divine origin of life and mind on this planet. The intelligent reader will not fail to note that in the presentation of the crucial facts and arguments I have not traveled outside of the data furnished by the leading evolutionary scientists. That is to say, I have not, in the later chapters, intruded the new psychology into the argument, nor drawn upon it for data, even for the purpose of fortifying the theistic interpretation of the facts of organic evolution. I have pursued this course, as indicated in the introductory chapter of Part 2, for the purpose of exhibiting the strength of the theistic argument when based alone upon the facts admitted by atheistic evolutionists, thus avoiding possible prejudices against the new psychology. Nor will the intelligent Christian reader fail to note that the most important conclusion derivable from what has been said is yet to be stated. And that is that, if our conclusions are valid regarding the divine origin of life, it follows that the truth of the Christian theory of the essential divinity of man is proved beyond a doubt. It now remains to show what light is thrown by the new psychology upon man's divine pedigree.